Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum of Iowa. The Iowa History 101 webinars share Iowa stories and the history of the state through a cultural history lens on the second and fourth Thursdays of each month. You can learn more about this series and all of our programs on our website at iowaculture.gov. Please remember to sign up for each webinar that you would like to attend. And don't worry if you can't watch live, all presentations will be recorded. Today, we will explore the lives of the first Chinese to reside in the US Midwest and examine how these immigrants were able to found businesses, small communities, win patrons and friends amongst Iowans, and resist racial discrimination and harassment in the 19th century. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. Closed captions are available by clicking the closed caption button on your screen. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Anthony J. Miller. Anthony is Assistant Professor of History at Hanover College in Indiana, where he teaches courses on World, East Asian, and Russian history. Previously, he worked as a professor at Miami University, as well as colleges in the People's Republic of China and Japan. He grew up in Iowa and attended the University of Northern Iowa before getting his PhD from the University of Kentucky. Much of his research focuses on transnationalism, exploring the mobility of missionaries, immigrants, Chinese Christians, agriculturalists, and exiles moving back and forth between the Midwestern US and China. His publications include a chapter in the history of Chinese food in Ohio for the new volume of America Chinese Restaurants, and another on missions and Chinese Christians in Southeast Asia during the Cold War for the Transnational Yearbook. And now I'm very happy to turn it over to Anthony to begin the webinar.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today, my talk for Iowa History 101 is titled Chinese Pioneers in Iowa, Immigration, Laundry, and Resistance to Exclusion in the 19th Century. But before I jump into my talk, I just wanted to say thank you again to Jennifer Cooley and Matt Beyer and the Iowa State Historical Society of Iowa. I think they've done an incredible job making the archives open to researchers and historians, and also developing new digital platforms to share history with the state of Iowa and its people under some pretty amazing conditions of the past few years in the pandemic. So on that note, thank you to Jennifer and Matt and the State Historical Society. By way of introduction to my talk, I'm going to start with an anecdote that I like to call the Sunday Schoolers of Des Moines, May 1881. On the evening of May 25th, 1881, 5 Sunday Schoolers in Des Moines left the Presbyterian Church, where they had been learning catechisms and hymns. And on their way home, local youths started shouting chants of rat eaters and pigtails, and they accosted them. The quintet of Sunday Schoolers, known to Iowans as Wing Feng, Ah Chi, Ah Ying, Sing Long, and Sam Hua, wore long flowing robes and fashioned their hair into a queue. They were laundrymen and among the first residents of Iowa to hail from China. Following Sunday school, these 5 men were headed home to their shops when they ran into the group of boys on 2nd Street near the Burlington and Quincy Railroad Depot. Accustomed to such treatment in the Midwest, the Sunday school students chased the young white boys off, hurling their own insults. In retreat, however, the youth ran into George Nash, an African-American man who chided the boys for being too cowardly to use the baseball club carried by one of the children. Taking the baseball bat, Nash led them back to the laundryman from China, where he then proceeded to crack Ah Ying over the head with it. Outraged, Ah Ying's countrymen seized Nash and went to turn him over to the Des Moines Police Department. But as they proceeded toward the police headquarters, a mob of a few hundred people surrounded the 4 uninjured Chinese laundrymen who were holding Nash. Suddenly, the residents of Des Moines were united in their hatred toward the Chinese, as over 40 men and the youthful instigators began what a local newspaper called, quote, a most outrageous assault upon the Celestials, end quote. Only the timely arrival of the Des Moines police saved the lives of the Presbyterian Church's Sunday school students. The mob quickly dispersed, leaving the Chinese bruised, beaten, and bleeding in the streets. Despite being the victims of this attack, Des Moines' Chinese laundrymen were hauled off to jail, along with Nash and one white assailant, D.H. Ruland. 3 of the 5 Chinese were charged with disturbing the peace and levied fines. Certainly, the racial dynamics of this explosive attack on Iowa's early Chinese are notable and quite suspicious. Out of the mob of hundreds, the police prosecuted Nash, an African American, and identified him by name as the instigator of actual violence in local media. Meanwhile, the white youths who had first accosted the Chinese Sunday schoolers, brandished a weapon, and participated in the attack, escaped identification in the public eye and any criminal charges. Law and order in Des Moines on that day in 1881 was meted out by deeming one white Iowan, one black Iowan, and all of the Chinese present as the guilty parties, an assignment of blame that held the working class and racial minorities disproportionately responsible for disrupting the peace. The racial climate in Iowa in this episode indicated that Chinese people in Des Moines had no right to self-defense from bodily harm or perhaps even death. Taken before the court and, according to one observer, frightened out of their wits and without an interpreter, the men received advice from an attorney and then they pled guilty and paid their fines. Anonymous members of the Presbyterian Church defended their honor, calling the violence uncalled for and disgraceful. Quoting a lady teacher from their Sunday school class, one paper described the men as, quote, quiet, industrious, peaceful men, end quote, who labored all week long only to spend their free Sundays trying to learn Christianity and the English language. The Presbyterian Church called the clubbing with a bat suffered by Ah Ying especially shameful. The immigrant laundry worker, according to his teacher, was an invalid and had spent the last few weeks gravely ill. Ah Ying was only able to come to church with his countrymen because they carried him there. And adding insult to injury, the victim had been robbed of $87 and a ring during the melee. Ultimately, the Iowa court legal system determined that simply by being present, by being Chinese, by virtue of their racial identity, they were all culpable for the violence inflicted upon them by the surrounding community. This attack on the Chinese laundrymen of Des Moines was not random. It occurred in a moment of rising national hostility toward immigrants from China. By the early 1880s, the anti-Chinese movement that had originated in California had spread across the nation and was building toward the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the nation's first immigration law barring access to the United States on the basis of race and class. And yet, in spite of that, from the 1880s onward, Iowa was home to a small number of very successful Chinese entrepreneurs who opened and owned laundries, restaurants, and dry goods stores into the 20th century. Far removed from the nation's more densely populated Chinatowns, what compelled these Chinese men to be the first pioneers from the Middle Kingdom to reach Iowa's small cities and rural towns? Without the resources and protection provided by those larger ethnic enclaves in cities such as San Francisco and Chicago, how did Chinese Iowans survive and carve out a living at a time of rising violence against their kind in America? And today marks the beginning of my talk, where I start to explore those issues of migration, survival strategies, and the resistance to exclusion that many Chinese Iowans exhibited in the 1880s and 1890s. The first wave of Chinese immigrants to the United States began in the mid-1800s on the West Coast with laborers in agriculture, mining, and railroad construction. At the time, the Qing Empire of China faced several severe problems, such as the Opium Wars, internal rebellion, and rapid population growth, which began a century of decline and turmoil in China. These forces ultimately pushed hundreds of thousands of Chinese abroad as a survival strategy. Many migrants set their sights upon the United States, known in China after the 1850s as the Gold Mountain because of the gold rush that drew waves of Chinese miners to California. American efforts to discourage Chinese immigration in the 1860s included special taxes on foreign miners. But the Burlingame Treaty in 1868, signed by the United States and the Qing Empire, established open immigration policies with guarantees of fair treatment and protection before the law for Chinese students, laborers, and merchants coming to America. By the 1870s and 1880s, however, sporadic economic depressions combined with the power of labor and politics laid the groundwork for the creation of a powerful anti-Chinese movement. Playing on the white public's economic insecurities and racial fears, groups such as the Workingmen's Party, led by Dennis Kearney, campaigned obsessively against Chinese laborers as a threat to the dignity and wages of white workers. Politicians from both the Democratic and Republican parties on the West Coast soon echoed Kearney in labeling the Chinese as, quote, an uncivilized menace, end quote, incapable of exercising democratic freedoms. Outside of politics, the use of violence, terror, and intimidation by the anti-Chinese movement increasingly restricted the lives of an isolated and relatively small minority group. For protection, Chinese Americans congregated in large cities and segregated districts known as Chinatowns, which allowed them to pool resources and make their livelihoods. As these Chinatowns on the West Coast, though, swelled from competition, overcrowding, and a scarcity of opportunity, this incentivized the continued migration of Chinese across the country. Violence followed in the migrants' wake as anti-Chinese riots and forced expulsions occurred in Tacoma, Washington, and Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, and then later in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1888. Chinese traveled farther eastward, finding new avenues for employment in the logging industry, manufacturing cigars, or as migrant farm workers and vegetable peddlers far off in the American South. Railroads recruited thousands of Chinese workers, with over 10,000 working on the Transcontinental Railroad. Iowa's first Chinese residents have received little attention from historians, yet their arrival, shortly after the Civil War, was widely known by Iowans at the time, who followed news stories of Chinese pioneers in the press. Indeed, a story in the Quad City Times from 1870 tells of a fight between a newspaper editor in Western Iowa and a, quote, washi, end quote, a derogatory term often used for Chinese people at that time who worked in the laundry. The laundry trade drew most Chinese migrants to Iowa as ordinary laborers, but a small number, such as a man known as R. Shang in Perry, Iowa, were merchants who opened cigar shops and storefronts dealing in a range of dry goods, such as teas and other imported items from China. Others worked in a variety of service jobs, such as part-time barber Joe Happy Singh of Cedar Rapids and Davenport. Much later in the early 20th century, a number of immigrants opened restaurants to bring the cosmopolitan craze of chop suey from the East and West Coast to the Midwest growing industrial and commercial hubs, such as the men who owned and operated King Ying Lo in Des Moines, Iowa in the 20th century. Still, most, such as Happy Singh, made much of their income working in a laundry. And among the earliest were Sam Lee's Laundry in Davenport and Ah Wing & Co. in Sioux City, both advertising their services in newspapers by 1875. By 1880, Iowa was home to just over 30 Chinese people, with most operating hand laundries along the railroads near cities such as Des Moines, Keokuk, Waterloo, Burlington, and Dubuque. In the following decade, scores of Chinese laborers began fanning out from these pockets to found laundries in much smaller towns such as Estherville, Algona, Story City, Carroll, and Fayette. Operating laundries in smaller, more rural settings, the presence of these Chinese pioneers shatters the perception of Iowa's small rural towns as homogeneous and remote places unconnected to global currents. Historians have only recently, though, started to unpack how Chinese came to dominate the laundry trade, which had once largely been performed by American women. And that process, at least partially, explains how even in a national climate of racism and violence against Chinese, they managed to survive in Iowa. According to historian Joan S. Wong, the origin of Chinese immigrants in the laundry trade reflect the twin forces of racism and sexism at play. Although indispensable to the economy of the American West, the racial hostility of American labor toward Chinese people soon led to their exclusion from a variety of jobs, such as mining and farming. This exclusion compelled most Chinese laborers to take up jobs as cooks, laundrymen, and domestic servants, trades traditionally performed by women in the 1880s and 1890s. But with a scarcity of Black and white female labor on the West Coast, American society accepted the performance of, quote, women's work, end quote, by Chinese men, denigrating them as feminine and less masculine than other American men. Washing clothes was typically reserved for women in China too, but the modest profits and restricted employment choices often made laundries the only choice for many newly arrived Chinese men. This combination of ideas rooted in race, class, and masculinity also kept many white Iowans from entering the laundry trade, despite it being quite profitable. And this aversion created an opening for Chinese people arriving in the 1870s and 1880s. Especially as the trade of laundrymen became associated with Chinese, an ideology of whiteness and manhood stigmatized the profession. For example, an editorial from the Elmira Gazette titled, quote, "Don't learn a trade," end quote, reprinted in the Burlington Hawkeye in 1878, exemplified the notion that work in a laundry was not fit for white American men. The author chided that working men in the laundry trade were insufficiently white or American, writing, quote, "Go hang your queue over a counter. Learn to talk twaddle to the ladies. Part your hair in the middle and make an ass of yourself generally, and work for wages that wouldn't support a Chinese laundryman on rice-fed rats," end quote. Thus, gender and racial stereotypes disparaging the Chinese were often used to shame white Americans into seeing the laundry as a lowly, unsuitable profession. In reality, a laundry was also extremely unattractive to many Americans because the work was physically demanding, tedious, and many times a precarious way to make a living. Typically, laundrymen worked 6 to 7 days a week for an average of 16 to 18 hours a day, starting in the morning and laboring well into the late night. Although few in number, Iowa's first Chinese were the subject of intense public fascination, as their arrival left Iowans and the larger Midwest divided over the Chinese question, a national debate about the right of Chinese people to enter the country and become citizens. In confronting the Chinese question, state officials and labor unions in Iowa consumed the vitriolic reports of anti-Chinese groups from the West Coast. Often these reports issued a direct warning to Iowa and the Midwest to take measures to ban Chinese people. In one such report, San Diego Chief of Police J.W. Brenning stated that, quote, "If the people of Iowa had as many Chinese as California, they would rise in open revolt against them," end quote. As a result, labor, politicians, and judges, along with media in Iowa, often regurgitated ideas produced by the anti-Chinese movements on the West Coast about the Chinese as a deplorable race. And because of this animosity, many of the first Chinese people to establish a hand laundry in new towns across Iowa found themselves almost immediately expelled by the local community. Sam Lee, for example, tried opening a shop in Cedar Falls in 1878, but he quickly abandoned the town for a new enterprise in Dubuque. An account of Lee's expulsion from the Courier notes that, quote, "Cedar Falls can't appreciate the Celestials, and so the Chinese must go," end quote. Adopting the rallying cry of the anti-Chinese movement out west, many Iowans tried to drive Chinese people from the state by refusing to patronize their businesses and inflicting upon them severe social isolation. Others were more direct, using harassment and the threat of violence. Hong Lee's attempt to open a laundry in Ames in 1882 illustrates the license afforded to youth to act hostile and violent toward the Chinese. Harvey Taylor was a teenager when Lee opened his laundry on Duff Street, and according to an account by Taylor years later, Lee's residence in Ames angered many of the town's elders. Meanwhile, Taylor and his friends decided to figure out a way to run him out of town, eventually forming a plot to send in a young woman to Lee's shop who would then scream for help. Under the pretext that Lee had assaulted and tried to rape the woman, men from around the town raced into the laundry. Faced with an angry mob threatening his arrest or murder, Lee immediately fled town, never to return. And in doing so, he left behind all his worldly possessions and forfeited the life savings that had cost him to start his business in Ames. Nativist Iowans often weaponized stereotypes about Chinese men as criminals and sexual predators to force their removal. Vandalism targeting Chinese laborers became a safe source of entertainment for bored youth or drunken adults. Linens left out to dry were smeared with mud or dust by young boys, a twisted game where youth delighted in forcing the Chinese to redo their work or be forced to reimburse customers for damaged items. And the toxic racial climate of the 1880s, even customers felt entitled to belittle, harass, and hit Chinese laundrymen. And although typically done by males, women in Iowa also inflicted harm upon them. One woman in Dubuque, for example, rose up and swatted a laundryman in his face simply because she believed he had overcharged her. Excuse me. On the other hand, a number of Chinese who pioneered the laundry trade in the Midwest garnered a warm reception from Iowans. For example, Chinese launderers in Davenport in the early 1880s were praised for making contributions to the opening of the city's art museum. Featuring exhibits of Chinese and Japanese silkworks, plaques, and embroidered screens, Davenport elites thanked the new laundryman Hua Sing for providing lanterns to the gallery opening and his own musical instruments, pipes, and porcelain for the public's viewing. And in many cases across Iowa, we feature similar news stories about the arrival of Chinese. Thus, some Iowans treated the establishment of a Chinese hand laundry as a key marker in the community's development, symbolic of the transition from frontier town to cosmopolitan city. And in this respect, some voices took the presence of Chinese in the Midwest, excuse me again, to signify a vibrant local economy and also the worldliness and sophistication of Iowans. The key for most Chinese pioneers was to find a community that would tolerate their presence and patronize their business, a search that made their already transient lives even more mobile. Simultaneously, many laundrymen resisted directly anti-Chinese violence and hostility. Ah Hua and Wang Feng of Waterloo exemplified the capacity of many Chinese pioneers in the Midwest to defend themselves quite ably. In the late 1880s, Ah owned a laundry on Waterloo's 4th Street, and he faced frequent harassment by locals, although his business enjoyed admirers as well. In the spring of 1888, Ah was walking along 4th Street with his employee, Wang, when a man named Bub Hurley saluted the two by hurling rats at them, a reference to the stereotype of Chinese as rat eaters. Wang approached Hurley, who began to strike and attack the laundryman. Having lived in the United States for over a decade by then, though, Ah was well prepared for random attacks. He opened his coat to pull out a hatchet, and he and Wang chased Hurley around Waterloo. The trio soon found themselves in the custody of police and presented before the town's mayor. Apparently, Hurley was a frequent instigator of brawls and sentenced to jail for 30 days. Wang and Ah were released with bonds to present themselves for a hearing. In defending their conduct, Wang proclaimed that they had chased had not chased Hurley in the hopes of harming him, but rather it was custom in China for the aggrieved to capture criminals and present them personally to the local magistrate. Despite wielding a deadly weapon, the mayor actually approved of Wang and Ah's defense of their lives and reputations. And the courier went so far as to declare them exemplary members of the community and representatives of their race, printing, quote, "If instead of deriding these Chinese boys as they pass them on the street, young men will take their conduct for an example, they will make much better citizens. Wang and Ah are quiet, inoffensive fellows, and our officers will see that they are protected from further insult," end quote. So at least in a few cases, Chinese immigrants in Iowa could carry weapons for self-defense and yet maintain their identities as, quote, quiet, inoffensive fellows, end quote, and persons of high character, and win a lot of admiration for their businesses. While many immigrants might have been drawn by dreams of gold and making a fortune, the Chinese who came to Iowa were not greenhorns, who were naive enough to think the state's inhabitants would automatically welcome them. Rather, Iowa's Chinese were pioneers. Their migration to the nation's center required they be intrepid and self-reliant, willing to face discrimination and societal violence alone, or in very small numbers, with far fewer resources than Chinese people living on the coast. Moreover, by being the first Chinese people in states like Iowa, they stretched the frontiers of Chinese civilization to America's heartland, enlarging transnational circuits of migration and managing to claim new territory for future generations of Chinese Americans. And their presence, even if fleeting or temporary, transported questions about race, immigration, and even trans-Pacific diplomacy directly into the heart of Iowa's communities, forcing them into larger national and global dialogues. Conversely, the previously mentioned 1882 riot in Des Moines against Sunday schoolers suggests that such measures were no guarantee against a sudden outburst of xenophobic violence or widespread racism. Without the pooled resources and community provided by Chinatowns, revolvers, hatchets, a sterling reputation, and the support of key allies in the form of customers, the press, civic leaders, and churches were all necessary for Chinese to survive in Iowa in the 19th century. More isolated and vulnerable than their kin, the life of Chinese pioneers in the Midwest was exceedingly dangerous and required enduring considerable risk and torment. For many, it was a living best summed up by a popular idiom known to Chinese in the 20th century as "chirku," which translates literally into English as eating bitterness. And the expression refers to bearing hardship, which for Chinese pioneers meant a lifestyle of hard work, social isolation, and confronting discrimination as the price of admission to having a life in Iowa. So I got a little bit behind on my slides there. Okay. The fate of two men exemplified the opportunity and risk Chinese Iowans faced in this era. Boone's Sam Key and Perry's R. Shang. Key was among the most financially successful of Iowa's early Chinese pioneers. By 1885, Key was reported to have amassed a savings account in excess of $3,000 and had announced plans to return home to China to marry. Key's success in Boone was embraced enthusiastically by residents, in part because the laundryman was known around town as a man who loved to have a good time. He was known for having a fondness for American food, and especially spirits and beer. Residents of Boone and readers across Iowa delighted in the thought that Key's laundry had made him a millionaire back home, where he would soon find a, quote, small-footed, end quote, wife to start his family, a reference to the fact that many Chinese women in the Qing Empire had bound feet. But he did not stay in China for long. A decade later, he was 40 years old and still laboring for 16 hours a day at his laundry in Boone. Despite the Chinese Exclusion Acts, he still moved infrequently back and forth between countries, from his business in Boone to his wife and family back in his home village in Guangdong province. His initial return to China had lasted just long enough, perhaps a year or two, for he and his parents to arrange a marriage and for he and his wife to have their first child. According to historian Madeline Y. Su, back in China, Key's time in the United States as a laundryman purchased him membership in a new, upwardly mobile class in society, commonly referred to in China as Jinshan Ke, or Gold Mountain Guests. Holding out a promise to return to the laundry trade in Iowa made him a prime candidate for marriage, as his wife would be entitled to large remittances, meaning large sums of money that he would send back to her, and the social prestige and envy of the local community as his Jinshan Po, or Gold Mountain wife. Holding out a promise to return to the laundry trade in Iowa made him, forced to endure separation. He and his wife could build a family privy to a high standard of living, material comfort, and climbing the social ladder, and bring glory to his family, his clan, and his village through his wealth. Over the coming years, on return visits spaced years apart, Key's wages in Iowa bought the couple a new home, land, and promised their sons and daughters an education and eventually very lavish weddings and rites of passage. Back in Boone in the 1890s and 1900s, Key and other Chinese Iowans fared comparably well. His success there as the city's lone laundryman in the 1880s eventually attracted a small colony of relatives. By 1903, now around 50 years old, Key set off on another trip home and was given another grand farewell party by his countrymen in Boone and residents before departing for San Francisco. It would be his last trip between the Midwest and China. Key died in transit, and the news shocked and saddened many people in Boone. The story of his death, printed under the headline, "Sam Key Dies on High Seas, Death Cheats Iowa Chinaman, a Fruit of Lifetime's Work," evoked pity from the local community. The Davenport Morning Star called his death on the journey home, quote, "pathetic," end quote, since it robbed him of the chance to, quote, "do honor to the graves of his ancestors and bring opulence to living relatives with his wealth for which he has labored a lifetime in the United States," end quote. The public reaction to Key's death showed that many Iowans, at the very least, pitied, if not admired, Key's success and commitment to his cultural heritage. Equally remarkable and tragic was the fate of a man first known to Iowans as R. Shong, and then later as Billy or William R. Shong. Unlike most of his brethren, R. Shong did not work in a laundry, but since the early 1870s, he had worked as a merchant and even a landlord in Iowa. Before spending nearly 2 decades in Perry, from roughly 1876 to 1894, R. Shong operated stores in Des Moines and West Branch, where he imported tea, ginger, coffee, and spices, and sold tobacco products to the public. In the early 1870s, the growing community around Des Moines received R. Shong and his Chinese employees warmly. In particular, noting the Chinese love of flying kites and for being, quote, "quiet and always well behaved," end quote. After moving his main store to Perry, R. Shong achieved tremendous commercial success, with newspapers such as the Sioux City Journal marveling at his storefront chock full of, quote, "dry goods, groceries, clothing, boots and shoes, notions, etc., amounting to fully $4,000, end quote, in his inventory stock. By the 1890s, he had managed to parlay his store's success into owning several newly built homes in Perry, which he rented out as a landlord. The rapport Shang acquired with the community in Perry was even more impressive. He was well known as a, quote, honest man, end quote. Perry residents became faithful patrons of his business, learning that unlike most of the Chinese in the United States, he first set foot on the East Coast. Leaving China as a young boy, Shang spent his early teens and 20s as a sailor, traveling the world and living in New York's Chinatown. Other accounts of his life told in the Algona Courier reported that he had been, quote, born on a pirate ship in the Chinese Sea, end quote, and visited England and Africa before coming to the United States. Residents of Perry were even more shocked to find out that Shang was a veteran of the US Civil War, employing his services on behalf of the Union Navy. Shang proclaimed that due to his service, he was one of the nation's few naturalized Chinese American citizens. He demonstrated his citizenship to Iowans by proudly voting in local and national elections. A popular figure in Perry, locals eventually took to calling him William or Billy, names he adopted to project a willingness to assimilate. His regular attendance at Presbyterian churches while living in both Des Moines and Perry also indicated his eagerness to become, quote, an American, end quote. New forms of Chinese exclusion, however, caused a sudden turn in his fate and his relationship to Iowans in the spring of 1894. Provisions of the 1892 Geary Act aimed to crack down on illegal entry to the United States by requiring immigration officials to register all Chinese Americans and immigrants, and requiring these immigrants to carry a certificate of residence at all times under the threat of fines, imprisonment, and possible deportation. Shang gained statewide attention in 1894 when he rebuffed immigration agents in Iowa who demanded that he register with authorities and also submit for a photograph for his residence certificate. As a citizen and a veteran, he refused. In defying the Geary Act in the 1890s, Shang was not alone. Other notable figures of the Chinese American community in Iowa, such as Joe Happy Singh of Cedar Rapids, and the entirety of Sioux City's Chinese population, loudly objected to the Geary Act and threatened not to comply. Singh, in fact, taunted immigration officials that he would prefer deportation on the dime of Uncle Sam as a free trip home to see family and relatives, rather than accept such humiliation. And Singh also taunted that he would eventually come back to the United States. Shang Singh and this generation of Chinese pioneers in the Midwest were rarely docile when faced with prejudice and discrimination. The majority of Chinese pioneers were almost never entirely sinners nor saints. Shang was no exception. His defiance of the Geary Act was unique from that of other Chinese Iowans in two respects. First, he claimed citizenship as a protection against the Geary Act. And secondly, his defiance coincided with his arrest on charges of larceny. Shang's relationship to the residents of Perry soured as law enforcement began investigating his business as a fence for stolen goods in December 1893. Clothing goods produced by the Rock Island Depot and shipped to Manning, Iowa, were reported stolen in February 1893. Missing for several months, Des Moines and Rock Island police collaborated on a raid of Shang's storefront, finding much of the clothing and many other items allegedly stolen from across the state in his storefront. Charged with larceny and subject to a flood of allegations from the surrounding area, Shang posted his own bail at a sum of $1,000, an enormous sum of money for the time, a move that regained his freedom, but likely did nothing to dissuade the public of his guilt. The story spread quickly, in part because of Armstrong's notoriety in Iowa and neighboring states such as Nebraska. Des Moines police accused Armstrong's store of dealing almost entirely in stolen goods, functioning as the headquarters for, quote, a den of thieves, end quote, operating in Des Moines and around central Iowa. Despite his good reputation and standing for nearly 2 decades, Iowa law enforcement and journalists now trumpeted, without, quote, any doubt, end quote, as one newspaper put it, that he had not only knowingly received stolen items, but labeled him as some kind of criminal mastermind behind robberies across the state. Armstrong's allies in Perry defended him from such charges with a Perry bulletin, dismissing such accusations by calling him too trusting, gullible, and, quote, bad, end quote, at business to have knowingly bought stolen goods. Statements of support from the community continued as the investigation lingered, with the Perry Daily Chief writing, quote, we think he was innocent of any intent to commit a crime. At least let us throw the mantle of charity over the questionable portions of his life, end quote. Under investigation and refusing to comply with the Geary Act, Iowa newspapers began applying labels such as, quote, obstinate celestial, end quote, to Armstrong, emphasizing again his racial otherness, rather than lovingly hailing him as the familiar Billy. Worse, in December 1894, Armstrong died from complications related to typhoid fever while still under investigation and refusing to comply with immigration agents. Circumstances changed the perception of him from a respected member of the community to a, quote, notorious Chinese receiver of stolen goods, end quote, and also, quote, famous Iowa criminal, end quote, according to the Algonia Courier. Convicted without trial in the court of public opinion and without an official will, the District Court of Dallas County took possession of all his assets, the storefront, its stock, his cash, and the homes and properties he owned around Perry. Beyond his outspoken repudiation of U.S. immigration, Armstrong challenged other provisions of the racial discrimination underlying the Chinese Exclusion Act by virtue of his property holdings. Beginning with the Naturalization Act of 1870, a number of state legislatures enacted alien land laws designed to prohibit Chinese and Japanese people from owning land and other private property for their businesses. In Iowa, by owning several homes and real estate, Armstrong had achieved feats denied to most Chinese Americans elsewhere in the country. Yet Armstrong's holdings were not bequeathed to his descendants or his relatives. Rather, when he died, his considerable property was liquidated and deposited into Iowa's educational funds for school construction. In the winter of 1895, the District Court of Dallas County auctioned off Armstrong's properties and belongings to the highest bidder, including individual lots larger than 2 acres. Back in China, a single 2-acre plot of land would have cemented Armstrong's place in the upper crust of his village, bringing renown to his family and clan, and the aspiration of becoming landed gentry that almost all Chinese men of his generation entertained, but few ever realized. This land and his property and his businesses might have also been a small beacon from the rural confines of Perry that drew his kin and fellow Chinese Americans to the Midwest to take up his business and parlay his wealth and standing toward their own dreams. Instead, all that Armstrong's 19 years in Iowa symbolized, an immigrant from the Middle Kingdom who became a Union veteran, a naturalized citizen, a successful merchant, a member of the local church, a proud voter, a wealthy landowner, all of that was forfeited at the auction. Together, Arshong and Qi and others from their generation cemented Iowa's ties to the Middle Kingdom and the Chinese exclusion era. The state's last Chinese American-owned hand laundries in Waterloo and Cedar Rapids, which were run by Dick Cole, Li Benny Wong, and Edward Fong, remained active until finally closing shop in the late 1970s. Celebrated then by Iowa press as laundry kings and historical landmarks, Wong, Fong, and Cole traced their roots in Iowa back to the relatives who entered the state in the 1880s and 1890s, and a generation of Chinese pioneers in the Midwest who, like Arshong and Qi, defied and resisted exclusion. With the experiences of these Chinese pioneers in mind, one should resist, as urged by historian Ashley Howard, the temptation to frame these stories as part of a, quote, triumphalist or exceptionalist narrative, end quote, that prompts one to conceive of Iowa as some kind of utopia for non-whites. Rather, recounting the experiences of Chinese Iowans makes pivotal contributions to the state's history and helps to deconstruct the dominant black-white binary that undergirds our study of race. The Chinese arrived in Iowa at a pivotal historical moment, following decades of dispossession that forced Native Americans from the scene on the heels of a civil war, which left African Americans free from slavery, but locked into another life and death struggle across the country against segregation and inequality. In breaking apart that black-white dichotomy and paying close attention to Chinese immigrants in Iowa, historians can sharpen and complicate our understanding of the past. And I apologize, somebody just started mowing outside of my office at the point that I reached the conclusion of my talk, a little bit early, but I now turn it over to Matt Beyer and invite questions from the audience. Thank you for attending my talk today.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. We have time to answer some questions. If you have a question, please submit it through our Q&A feature here on Zoom, but please note we may not be able to get to all the questions. So let's start with, I think, an important question to me. How did you become interested in researching this particular topic?
I kind of worked from kind of front to back. I became most interested as a historian of US-China relations about the history of Chinese Americans and immigrants in Iowa by studying the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa and the important work of a very popular author in the 20th century, Hualing Nie Engel, who helped launch the program along with Iowan Paul Engel in the 1970s and 1980s, a program that brought an incredible number of prominent literary figures and artists and filmmakers from places like the People's Republic of China and Taiwan, and also the rest of the Chinese diaspora around the world, to Iowa. And then as I started to look at those things, I discovered these much more enduring ties, things like soybeans, things like pheasants, all these things that have their roots in China and Chinese civilization, like the hand laundry that we see disappear in the 1970s. They arrive in Iowa very shortly after the Civil War and in the late 19th century. And so that's really where my fascination with the ways in which China has been essential to the development of Iowa, its environs, its society, its economy, its agriculture, and its natural landscape. China is really something that in some ways is so important it goes, it almost kind of disappears in its legacy because it seems so natural and organic to the state's development.
Our next question is a two-parter. With such a small population of Chinese immigrants in Iowa in the late 1800s, did you have any difficulties finding sources regarding a topic? How and where did you find sources?
That's a great question. Yes, finding sources is incredibly difficult. And a word of warning is that we will not find many sources that were produced by the subjects themselves, by Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants. Instead, largely what we're going to find is census records, city directories, newspapers, naturalization records, all products of their presence and their arrival, but very few firsthand accounts of things penned or produced by Chinese Americans, immigrants, and Iowans themselves. Occasionally, we get glimpses into their psyches and personalities as they're quoted in the press, but even that becomes very difficult because a popular convention in American newspapers, as well as books and novels and other print culture of the time in the 19th century and even throughout much of the 20th century, is to kind of distort a Chinese voice by printing it up in misspelled words into kind of pidgin English, even as many Chinese Americans sometimes became quite fluent. So there's all kinds of barriers towards sources, but most of what I'm finding for sources are newspaper accounts and interviews with Chinese and Chinese Americans, city directories listing their businesses and advertising their services, naturalization and immigration records, and also church records. I would say a majority of Iowa's Chinese attended churches and Sunday schools, if not only to learn English, in part to gesture towards the larger community, their interest in Christianity, but also in becoming fully fledged members of the communities. So sometimes a very sincere religious calling, and other times a very open social gesture of their willingness to kind of be accepted as part of Iowa, if only the community would also reciprocate that gesture.
Our next question, did the Chinese pioneers come from other areas in the United States, such as West Coast, East Coast, or South, or did they mostly come from China?
Okay, yeah, excellent. Especially this first generation, they're coming from other parts of the United States. Like I mentioned in my talk, our Shong is out in New York and Massachusetts in the 1850s and 1860s before coming to Iowa in the 1870s and remaining there into the 1890s. Most are coming from other destinations, and especially Iowa's Chinese, they're very transient, very mobile. They're coming from the West Coast, and they're also going in and out of the state quite frequently, or moving around the state, setting up shop in one store. And then if that doesn't go well, then they try relocating to another town to see if that's more receptive or profitable. So they're just constantly in motion. So keeping track of them for a historian is really difficult research. Now, once they set down roots, especially as a small number of them, particularly in Cedar Falls and Waterloo, managed to find wives and actually establish families, then we start to see a second generation of relatives and clansmen pulled directly to Iowa from those places. And often that means that they're coming in not from the West Coast and the East Coast, but they're actually entering Mexico and Canada and then crossing the borders in the middle of North America to get to Iowa and their relatives to begin their lives in the American Midwest.
Our next question, in your research, did you find any evidence of intermarriage of Chinese Americans and white Iowans in 19th century Iowa?
Absolutely. I've found at least two so far. The subject of my talk is an article that I produced for the Annals of Iowa. And in those, I mentioned one man, Sam Singh, who marries a white Iowan in the 1880s. Another is a man who establishes quite a family that goes on to run these laundries in Cedar Falls and Waterloo, the Fongs. And he, as early as the 1890s, very publicly proclaims in the newspapers and the community his desire to marry a white Iowan and establish a family. He mentions cutting his queue. The queue is a symbol of loyalty to the Qing emperor, and by cutting his queue and growing out his hair, he's showing that he's hoping to become a Chinese American and set up a permanent life here in the United States, rather than being someone who's seen by the community as a sojourner, going back and forth, kind of just staying in the US to make enough money to go back home and marry and stay there. Fong in the Waterloo area instead cuts his queue, grows out his hair, marries a woman, and establishes a family of 3 or 4 in the early 1900s that even uses his profitable business in Waterloo and Cedar Falls to purchase a home, kind of in a wealthier neighborhood. Tragedy eventually befalls their family as he's forced out of Iowa and is unable to rejoin them by the Chinese Exclusion Acts, and a number of tragedies. But yes, there's a small number, which is quite risky. A law passed in the 1870s by the US government actually means that any woman, any domestic American woman who marries a Chinese citizen takes on the citizenship status of her husband, which means that American women who marry Chinese men technically forfeit their citizenship and rights in the United States under this law. So it comes with considerable risk to do so.
Switching gears a little bit, someone asked, in your research, did you find any Iowa Chinese recipes?
Iowa Chinese recipes. I haven't, but there is this great cultural bridge between Iowa and China in terms of food, and that is pork. Iowa and China are both on the same page, at least northern China, when it comes to pork. And there's a lot to be mined there. That's a really great question. I wish I had. If anybody else has found one, please chime in. I will say there's an account of a journalist in Sioux City early on in the laundries where he goes for a visit to a Chinese laundry and he writes about what his experience is like, and he talks about how great the Chinese spare ribs are. They had treated him as a patron, as a customer of their laundry, to a free sampling of these Chinese style spare ribs, and he goes on endlessly about how good it is.
And to keep us in time, this will be our last question for today. But a person wrote in talking about their own research in their Iowa community and how they actually found 2 laundries operated by Chinese in the early 1900s. They wrote that it also seems there's always someone to fill in while the owner was away. The question here, though, is, was there some sort of regional network of sorts to help fill in and help each other?
Yes. So the best book for talking about this in some ways is Madeline Sue's book, Dreaming of Gold, Dreaming of Home, or an older book by a Chinese sociologist and study of immigration, Paul Sui. I think that title of that book is just called The Chinese Laundromat. But through kind of clan-based organizations, so relatives or native place societies, so like institutions built up by a village, many of the issues of cooperation, of financing for Chinese businesses, those are all like run through these networks. So a lot of times, to get back to their question, you would depend on relatives, cousins or brothers or people from your native place, people from the same village that you knew of, to come help carry the load of running your laundry, especially because most anticipated making return visits once the Immigration Act started to bar Chinese from coming back to the United States. They really relied on each other because they might have a difficult time re-entering the country or be gone for years at a time, expecting someone that they could trust to run their businesses. Those kinds of native place societies, clan-based organizations, or sometimes even the triads, which a lot of times are known popularly in the United States as just kind of gangs or criminal networks. They also performed a lot of important civic and social functions for Chinese in the United States and also back home. Those institutions really helped arrange this cooperation that was necessary to keep laundries open, where people would have to like leave or entrust their laundries for long periods of times to others. But yeah, that's a great pickup in their research. And it explains in part why this Chinese network in Iowa was also dependent upon Chinese in other states and neighboring states. You would often see them go fill in for friends in Nebraska or Minnesota or Illinois. So they're moving in and out of state all the time. I really applaud that observation. That person's doing some great work.
Well, with that answer, we will bring this webinar to a close. Thank you to everyone joining us today. And we would like to extend one last thank you to our presenter, Anthony. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep, thank you. We hope everyone will sign up for our Iowa History 101 webinars that take place on the second and fourth Thursdays throughout the year. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. Now, for more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. This webinar and past presentations are available on our website as well. And while you're there, you can look into some other fantastic programs we have, such as our Goldie's Kids Club activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. We look forward to virtually seeing you here all again on Thursday, September 8th. Thank you all again for joining us today and have a great afternoon. Thanks, everyone.